Please join Joni, me, and welcome to celebration today, John Ramsey. John, God bless you. You know, let's start off by saying this. Almost the whole world knows about the tragic loss of Jean Benet, but a lot of people don't also realize that you actually lost three very important females to death.
Yes.
Three, not just one.
Yes.
One is terrible enough, but three, that is just beyond my comprehension.
Well, it's been a rough road, but God has gotten me through it, and I see that very clearly, that that's how I got through it.
Okay, and so tell us about Miss Elizabeth first.
Well, Elizabeth was my oldest daughter, and had just graduated from Miami of Ohio University and started work as a Delta flight attendant, and was in Chicago to visit her special boyfriend's parents for the first time, and they were on their way to a museum in the middle of the day, and both were killed in a car accident.
Oh my.
And just rocked my world to its foundations, and rocked my faith to its foundations as well.
This was 1992.
92, and
you didn't have the relationship with the Lord at that time.
no,
that you have today.
I called myself a cultural Christian. I was a Christian because I was born into a Christian home and went to church because that was the right thing to do. Didn't really go much deeper than that, quite honestly. And so when that happened, you think, wait, that's not supposed to happen. That's not the deal. You know, I'm supposed to be protected, and I didn't really understand what God promised and didn't promise us. And
You even got angry at God.
oh,
for a
I
little
did.
Bit, didn't
I
you?
mean, as I received that phone call that morning from my brother to tell me that Beth had been killed, I just jumped up and just threw the phone down and just screamed, "There is no God! There is no God!"
Wow.
Because I thought, how could a loving God let this happen to this beautiful child who had so much to give to the world? And it really, fortunately, there was a bedrock of faith that my mother had instilled in me by dragging me to the Episcopal church we went to in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so I really began to question and try to understand what God's promises were and what Christianity was and what the message was. What really could I take to the bank, so to speak, and what and most importantly, was this great Christian promise of everlasting life really true? Would I ever see Beth again? I wasn't willing just to accept that. I wanted, I'm an engineer by education, so I've got to analyze things and think through them. And I spent a lot of time reading and studying and questioning, asking questions. Some friends came alongside me and helped me. A good friend of mine who I had been a business partner with for several years, our business relationship, called and said, "John, I want to spend some time with you." And so I said, "That'd be wonderful." He said, "I've been praying for you for 10 years.
Wow.
And I think it's time that we really spend some time together. I'm going to teach you how to study the Bible." And we met once a week and had Bible study one-on-one.
And you were open at this point.
Oh, I was totally open. I was trying to understand what this was all about, because I hadn't really was never forced to ask that question. And
I think a lot of people didn't. I know I didn't really realize that you had lost Beth, your daughter, actually years before you would
4 years before.
Before you would lose Jean Benet.
Yes.
And so that loss, I mean, was already something you dealt with, but so you began to study the Bible once a week. And how did that change your life, John?
Well, it really, I began to understand the Bible. My friend said, I forget which book we started, it was Philippians or Romans. He said, "We're going to spend 6 months on Romans." I'm thinking, well, I can read it in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
How can we spend 6 months? But he really taught me how to study the Bible and to dig into it and understand what it was really saying, and we talk about it. And it was just all of a sudden, it was making sense to me. I told him, I said, when I first started to read the Bible as a cultural Christian, it seemed like I was reading it backwards. It didn't make any sense. He said, "Well, that's a gift of the Holy Spirit, that you now understand it." And I really began to dig in, and I asked those hard questions that I think a new believer or potential believer asks. What about the resurrection? Is that, how can I accept that and not just take it at face value? And my faith kind of transitioned from this intellectual study and challenging, you know, and I read a lot of books where the author had done the same thing, to accepting it, and then it went kind of from my head to my heart, and that really was the transition I went through.
You know,
but it took several years.
Yeah, it's an ongoing, it's an ever-growing process. We should continue our study of the Word, our prayers, our daily fellowship with God. You know, Joni and I we both read the book, and then we realized something that made it even more special to us. That JonBenet, this beautiful little blonde, was born in 1990. And our beautiful little blonde, Miss Rachel Michelle, was also born in 1990, and we still have her. And when she came home last night from college, from spring break, the first thing I did is just hug her and tell her I love her.
Yeah.
And I thought about you, John, that at least right now you're not able to do that, but you're going to.
I know.
You're going to get to one day, and so I'm so grateful, honey, that we haven't been through something as tragic as this.
One of the things that fascinated me so much with the story was because we have a daughter exactly the same age with blonde hair and blue eyes. In fact, I think we got maybe a picture of Rachel we can show. There's Rachel. She's just turned 22, and she's a senior, you know, in college. And so it really caught my attention, the story, because I had a daughter exactly the same age. And so let's move forward a little bit into...
Well, let's show a little bit. We've got some video of JonBenet. Let's see her. She was just the prettiest little girl ever. So full of life, so charming, such personality. She was always laughing and smiling. And, I mean, she was just very, very special. John, how does that make you feel seeing her like that?
Oh, it brings smiles to me. You know, a minister in Atlanta told me, he said, John, the memories that bring pain today will bring smiles tomorrow.
Wow.
And I found that to be very true.
So
it was hard to believe it back then, though, wasn't it, when he first told you?
Yeah, very hard to believe
So
that.
how hard is it to look at that, or is there like a joy that you have now that you can watch it?
It's a joy. She was a beautiful child on the inside, and a spark plug in our family, and you know, even though we suffered intense pain, it was wonderful to have her for those 6 years, and a blessing.
1996, December, was like a roller coaster ride for John Ramsey and his family, because in December his company hit the $1 billion sales mark. But then the tragedy struck, because on December the 26th is when you found JonBenet, and right there in your own house. I mean, I can't, you know, that had to be one of the most shocking things that anybody could ever experience. I mean, your little girl dead, but right there in your own house.
Yeah. Yeah, your house is your refuge, and at that instant it wasn't anymore. We never went back in that house again after that morning.
Wow.
I couldn't do it. And you know, when I found her, it was both a relief and a horror. I mean, I was just relieved to find my baby, but realized pretty quickly that she was not alive.
You know, one thing I've told Joni many times over the years, that to be falsely accused would have to be one of the most terrible things that anybody could ever go through. I guess the only thing would be worse is if you were falsely accused and then incarcerated on top of that.
Yeah, and that's happened, of course.
So you and Patsy and your son Burke, at one time or the other, each of you were under the suspicion of the murder of your precious little girl. How did you cope with that? How did that make you feel? What kind of thoughts went through your head going through that?
It was, I guess, a progression in that when we were first told that we would be investigated, we were shocked. You know, how could you possibly think that? But we said, okay, we accept that, anticipating that that would be a short process and then the investigation would move on. And we kept thinking, well, they're going to eventually realize that, you know, we were a loving family and there was no history of any problems and all the factual things that they should be looking at, and then move on. Well, they just never did. You know, they made their decision that day, and
why, have you ever figured out why they wanted to accuse you and Patsy of this, and they never would look at anything else.
Well,
It's
you know, being a detective takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of skill and a lot of experience, and that sadly was missing in our case. And so it was an easy solution to a horrible problem. And
because people were wanting to find
and
the
they
killer.
wanted to know. They didn't want to imagine that there was this kind of a monster out there that would come into your home and take your child from their bed and brutally murder them. And so it was an easy answer. And I think they just convinced themselves that that was the answer, and they just had to go about proving.
And then once they had made this big public pronouncement of this, their pride and ego probably didn't allow them to consider anybody else.
Pride and ego can be very dangerous when it involves administration of the law. That's right.
So I love in the story where you talk about this famous detective that actually took the case on, and you actually ended up becoming friends. And when he came to look at it, he actually came thinking you were probably guilty.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, Lou Smith was a legendary detective, had retired from Colorado Springs, and
he was a believer.
He was a strong believer, and would. And I can tell you more about that, but Lou had solved over 200 homicides in his career as a police. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Many of them cold cases, but he was a detective's detective, and he was brought in after a month or two by the district attorney's office to look at things, and he told me much later, he said, I expected to collaborate the police decision that you were guilty. And he said, after looking at it for about a month, I realized that they were going down the wrong path, and became almost a single-handed, sole-standing advocate of our innocence, internal to the system, and then eventually left the district attorney's office and continued to work on the case on his own time until his death a year and a half ago. Amazing man, but a very strong believer. Would come to our house in Boulder every morning before he started to work on the case and pray, and that's how we first met him.
So there were a lot of things that you really need to get the book to really hear the whole story.
Oh, yes.
But
all those details.
Why did Lou change his mind about you guys not being involved in it? What were some of the things that pertained to the case?
He was a seasoned detective and had that ability as a detective to look at the evidence and not let his opinion steer him in a direction. And that's a unique, it takes time to develop that kind of skill. But he started looking at the evidence. We had DNA, we had fingerprints, we had a broken window, an open door, and there was no history in the family of any problem. The kid's doctor said we were a loving family. We had all this testimony about that we were a normal family. And so Lou felt that the predominance of evidence was that there in fact was an intruder. And so that was the path he was going down. And thankfully...
And there had been an intruder.
Well, yes.
Near your home, where actually a man had broken into a house, but they never tried to follow up after that.
That very similar circumstance happened several months later. Man came into the home, waited till the family went to bed. It was in the daughter's bedroom. Thankfully, the mother heard a noise and chased him off. Identical pattern, but was not there was no interest in linking the two.
Now, let me say something right here. It's amazing how the news media focuses on negative things. You hardly ever hear any positive news, I guess because maybe it doesn't sell papers or it doesn't bring ratings. And when the news falsely or incorrectly or wrongly accuses somebody and then they're cleared, it's incredible to me how there's hardly any time spent correcting their error or admitting they're wrong. So I want to just say right up front, in case you didn't hear this, that in 2008, by scientific DNA evidence, John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey all were 100% cleared of any involvement in the death of John Bonet. You heard all of the accusations for years and years and years. In fact, they received more media attention than even the death of Princess Diana, if you can imagine that. So in case they didn't hear that, John, I want them to know right up front.
Oh, thank you.
That good news. And of course, the sad thing is that Patsy didn't live to hear that official exoneration. But if she had, what would she have said? How would she have reacted, you think?
Well, Patsy was a very strong woman, knew who she was, her friends knew who she was. I think she would have felt the same way I did, that this was progress on the path of finding the truth. We didn't view it as a closure point necessarily. We were grateful for the effort that had been put into that, coming to that conclusion. I viewed it as, okay, this is significant progress now. We can now move on to finding the killer. It's one step closer to finding the truth. I think Patsy, we were very grateful for all the people that worked hard on that over really a period of 7 years, I think. And she would have been grateful.
You know, we have some video of Patsy, and when I was reading in the book that they'd done a TV interview with Pastor Wayne Cordero in Honolulu, Hawaii, I said to the staff, let's get that video because we need to hear from Patsy. Yeah. She was such a beautiful lady and such a vital part of this story, and was such a strength to you in the midst of this. Y'all were a team together. So let's go now back to 2006, and this was just like a few weeks actually before she passed away. So let's see a little bit of this interview, the TV program from New Hope Christian Fellowship.
Well, I'm just thankful that we do not grieve as those who have no hope. I mean, we have hope of life eternal in Jesus, and without that, I would never see JonBenet again. But because I believe in the death and resurrection, and that we will again be reunited, it gives me hope to get up in the morning. It's just everything. It is just everything. When you have nothing left, but you know I have children on this earth that need me, and I love, and I have a job to do that God has given me to do, and I try to listen for that daily. But I know, and of course I'm going through cancer again, and I don't know how long I'll live. God knows, and until that day I will profess His name to everyone I can. But I know that when I'm absent from the body, I will be at home with the Lord. And JonBenet and Beth and my mother, who has since passed away, and you know, all the fun people are starting to be over there. So it's going to be a glorious reunion. You know, no offense, anybody.
Well, we're talking with John Ramsey today as our special guest, and his book is entitled The Other Side of Suffering. And if you've ever gone through loss, or you know somebody that has, this book would be tremendous to help somebody in their perspective on how to process their pain, how do you make it through to the other side, and also how you can turn it into something positive. You know, when you go through suffering, there's always a purpose behind it. God wants to take your pain, and He wants to get glory, and He wants to use you to be a blessing and to minister to others. John, have you found that to be true? Have you been able to talk to other people that have suffered loss?
I have. In fact, that's really the primary reason I wrote the book, was to try to share my experience and encourage people, both in their personal journey and recovery and also their spiritual journey, because I learned both and progressed both in both avenues of my life. And I've had the opportunity to talk to people and appreciate the opportunity.
And now you're talking to lots of people.
Well, I hope so. That's the intent. That was the intent.
Amen. John?
Well, you know, one of the thoughts I had as I was watching Patsy, I know you have thought about that reunion of her and JonBenet when she went to heaven, and she is in heaven, and I'm sure that had to put a smile on your face knowing they were reunited.
Oh, it did.
Because they were so close, weren't they?
Very close. Yes, they really were.
Well, you know, our assurance today, is it possible, John, after going through something as traumatic as you went through, to actually be healed and restored?
it's possible you're different, obviously, because I met a mother who said she had a hole in her heart that won't go away, and that was her death of her young daughter. But you can be a better person, a more at peace person. A friend of mine challenged me to anticipate that the best days of my life are in front of me. And at first that was hard to accept, but then I got to thinking about that. Absolutely, I need to believe that, and that's the definition of hope. And yes, you can get there, and that's part of why I wrote the book, was to encourage people to realize that you can get there. Not easy, doesn't happen overnight, but you will get there.
You know, grieving has to do with loss. And the Bible says, grieve not, but it doesn't stop there, because some people think, oh, if you're a Christian and you have faith, you shouldn't grieve, you shouldn't be sorrowful. That's not what the Bible says. It didn't say grieve not and then period. It says grieve not as those who have no hope. We do have hope. And grief is a process. Somebody said there's like 5 stages of grief, and at some point you're going to go through all 5 of them. But it's something that you need to go through. It's all right to cry. It's all right to be sad. But you don't stay that way forever. But you need to go through that process. And if you're a family member or a friend, you need to understand that. And you need to allow that family member or friend to go through that grief. And you just need to be there. You don't need to preach to them. You don't need to tell them to quit crying and suck it up and go on with your life. But you just need to be there to say, I'm here with you. I love you. I'm praying for you. I know you're hurting. And anything you need, I'm right here, and I'm praying for you, and I'm standing with you every step of the way. That's what you need to do. We've got a roll-in that we want to show you now that just gives a little overview of what we're talking about today. And I appreciate what Joni said. If you are hurting today, if you're lonely, if you feel that great sense of loss and you're full of despair, and maybe Satan is trying to turn your despair into depression, the Lord can help you today. He really, really can. And if we can pray with you about it, that's why we're here. So call that number and let us pray. Let's go to this roll-in right now.
He was a wealthy businessman and CEO, father to 5 children, and husband to his wife, Patsy. John Ramsey's life was a perfect depiction of the American dream until his 22-year-old daughter, Beth, was killed in a car wreck just 6 months after her college graduation. 4 years later, John experienced another tragedy that changed the course of his life forever. On Christmas Day, 1996, the Ramsey family enjoyed what seemed like the perfect Christmas, a stark contrast to what happened the next morning. When John and Patsy awoke, they discovered their daughter, Joan Bonet, was missing. A 6-year-old child, full of life and often seen in beauty pageants, became the center of a demanding ransom note left behind. The police arrived at the Ramseys' home and the search began. And 8 hours later, Joan Bonet's body was found in the family's basement. The attention quickly turned to finding the killer. The tabloids, newspapers, and even police seemed to give the family no time to grieve, as many began suspecting the parents as the blame. 10 years later, while still under investigation, John was left wifeless after Patsy's battle with ovarian cancer ended. The Ramseys were eventually cleared of all allegations, and John remarried in 2011. John now shares his story as proof that there is another side to suffering.
John, one of the things that you talked about in your book that I could relate to so well is that here you are, you're the father and the husband, and this happened right in your house. And a man, you know, a father and husband, part of our role is we're the provider and we are the protector.
Yes.
And you had done great on the provision part, but here this happens right in your house. How did that make you feel to think, you know, on my watch, in my house, this happens to my daughter? That had to be a huge impact to you.
Yes, it was. You want to protect your children. I would have given my life for John Bonet in an instant, without hesitation, and yet I was asleep. And, you know, you can't protect your children from everything in life.
That's right.
But it's important that your home be secure and a refuge, particularly because you're going to be asleep. I never imagined that someone would come into our home when we were there.
Because that's pretty rare.
It is rare. And but I regret that I didn't view my home as a fortress and a safe haven for my children more than I did. We thought we lived in a simple, small, peaceful community, and our guard was down. We were complacent, but evil can strike anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you just have to not be paranoid, but just be prudent.
All right, let me ask another question about Bert. Here he is, he went through being accused of maybe being the perpetrator, and then here's all this attention on his sister.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if he ever felt, well, what about me?
Well,
why, do y'all still love me? Everybody's focusing all their emotion and energy on JonBenet. How did that affect him, if at all?
Well, that's an important point, because what I've observed in some friends of mine who've lost children is that they can focus on the lost one at the expense of the children that are living and need them more than ever. And we were pretty aware of that because we'd experienced that with Beth 4 years earlier. And the first thing that really got us up off the floor and out of just desperate grief was the fact that we realized we had to be good parents for our other children, who we loved just as much, just as dearly, and needed us now more than ever to be strong parents. We focused very hard on Burke's life to try to give him shelter him from the chaos that was going on around us, give him a normal childhood the best we could. And I think we're reasonably successful at that. Burke has done very well. I'm very proud of him. But he knows without a doubt that we loved him and do love him.
So tell us about the two boys. What are they doing and how are they doing?
Well, my children are all doing well. I'm grateful. They're all employed, which is wonderful these days.
Good.
My oldest son works for a medical devices company, and Burke graduated from Purdue University in computer science and is working for a high-tech company, and just couldn't be prouder of both of them.
Kind of like following in his dad's footsteps.
Well, a little bit.
I know Purdue's an engineering school.
Yeah. I'm very proud of him. My daughter has 3 boys, 11, 7, and 9, and she's doing wonderfully well. And so
that's awesome.
I'm grateful.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the book, and I remember the interviews, the Larry King, that you and Patsy did, and always that air of suspicion that surrounded you, that you literally walked under that suspicion for, 12 years?
Yeah, approximately, yeah.
And how did you deal with that, knowing that people were looking at you and judging you and whispering and all of that?
Well, we knew who we were. God knew who we were. Our friends knew who we were. And it was amazing how many people reached out to us that we didn't know. One of my favorite stories is Patsy was on a street corner in Atlanta one afternoon, and this taxi cab screeched to a halt, stopped traffic. This big guy gets out and says, "Are you Patsy Ramsey?" And I said, "Yeah. I just want to give you a hug." And he gave her a big hug, got back in his cab, and drove off. That happened all the time. Yeah. And so we were just overwhelmed by the goodness of our fellow man and the compassion they showed for us.
Because all along the path, God would let you and Patsy see little signs of His love and His attention.
Absolutely. God, I believe without a doubt that God works through people. That's how He gets things done. The Bible is full of stories of how He worked through people. And we experienced that in our life. We didn't recognize it necessarily at the time. But in retrospect, you look back and think that was God's hand.
I've said to Joni, since we've been married, I don't know how many times, because we've been accused of things. Listen, it's terrible to be falsely accused. We at least hadn't been accused of anything to the degree that John and his family went through. But regardless, it's still terrible to be accused, and then you think, well, I need to defend myself, and I need to make an explanation. But this is something I told Joni many, many times, and you said the same thing, so you're echoing that same refrain. God knows what the truth is, and we know what the truth is, and I would rather care more about what God knows than what people think, because what people think most of the time is not true.
One of the stories you share that was really touching early on, right after JonBenet was murdered, you didn't go back into the house, but there was a family member that went back into the house. And as she was getting clothes for you guys and for Burke, and she went into Jean Benet's room, and for whatever reason, there was one little item that she just felt like she needed to bring to you and to Patsy. Tell us about that.
Well, that had huge impact on my life. John Benet had won this little medal about 5 days before, a talent award, and I'd always talk to her about, your talents. If you're going to do these little pageants, work on your talent. Doesn't matter if you're the prettiest or have the prettiest smile. And she would always, that was kind of our deal,
Yeah.
And so she won this little medal, and she came running up to me with it, put it around my neck, said, "Daddy, I won this for you." And I was really touched that she would even share it with me. And then, of course, 5 days later, she was gone. And in my mind, I thought, I want to get that medal. I want to get that medal. Didn't tell anybody.
You didn't tell anyone?
Didn't tell a soul. But I just thought, someday I want to get that medal. That's the one thing of John Benet's that I have. My sister-in-law, Pam, went back to the home 3 days after her murder to get some clothes for us. Came back to where we were staying and said, "John, I just had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to go to John Benet's room." She had to go through police tape and bring you this.
There it is, right
And
there.
she opened her hand, and this medal was in her palm, and I just burst into tears. But they were tears of joy, because to me it was just a message to me that, "Daddy, I'm okay."
Wow.
And you carry that around with you everywhere, don't you?
I do. Hasn't left my possession ever since.
Amazing.
But it was a touch from heaven, and that's how I viewed it. I just all of a sudden I realized that was a little message to me that, "Daddy, I'm okay."
Well, our special guest is John Ramsey in this new book entitled The Other Side of Suffering. It's available wherever books are sold, or of course you can go online to Amazon.com. I can wholeheartedly recommend it. I read every word, and so did Joni, and we both read it in just a few days. And in fact, she was reading it first, and it was the only copy they had, and said, "I want to read it, I want to read it, I want to read it." I told the staff, and they went and got me a copy, and so every night before I'd go to bed, I'd read about 25 or 30 pages, and it was really, really tremendous. John, we've only got just a moment. You and I were talking during the song. What are just some of the simple things that somebody can do when they have a friend or a family member that has suffered great loss?
Well, the biggest thing, as you said earlier, was just be there. A hug counts for everything. You don't have to say a word. In fact, C.S. Lewis put it pretty well. He said, when he lost his wife, he said, "I love having people around me. I just wish they would talk to each other and not to me."
Wow.
And so just be there for your friends. Don't worry about saying anything profound, or just give them a hug and be there.
Joni?
I wonder, in fact, I was going to ask that same question. What about the forgiveness part?
I spent a lot of time thinking about forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I went through several stages of how I should feel. Of course, the first one was, I can't do that. I can't forgive. But I ended up at a point where I realized that forgiveness was a gift I gave myself. I released that anger and that desire for revenge and to get even. Didn't matter if the person wanted to be forgiven, even knew they were being forgiven.
Yeah.
It was a gift I gave myself.
Yes.
And it was a release, and I could move on.
Here is someone from Maine actually watching right now, and Lydia, she said, "I just want you to know, John Ramsey, we love you and we are for you." I know that's got to encourage you.
Very encouraging.
And here's someone watching from New Hampshire asking us to please pray. They have lost 3 out of 4 of their children.
Wow.
I have met people, I don't know how they do it. And that's a horrible loss to deal with as a parent.
Yes. And here's someone, Sarah from McKeesport, Pennsylvania, saying, any leads on who committed this crime or any closer to solving it?
Well, I don't know for sure. Lou Smith worked very hard on it, literally up to his death. I visited him in hospice, and he was reciting off things to be done in the case.
And you spoke at his memorial service.
I was honored to speak at his funeral service. He was a great man.
So you're not really putting all your focus on, we must find the killer.
No.
You've kind of put that in the hands of the Lord.
It's in God's hands. And I told a friend once, I said, we've been praying for years that God would reveal the killer, and he hasn't done so yet. And my friend said, maybe you're not ready for that yet. I thought, you're probably right.
But I do want to clarify, I know you mentioned earlier, but the DNA evidence that was found, there were, I guess, two parts of it.
Well, let's just say it this way. In 2008, the District Attorney's Office of Boulder, Colorado, through scientific DNA evidence, 100% exonerated and cleared John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey of any involvement in the murder of John Benet Ramsey.
Yeah,
So
but
they were scientifically and legally cleared.
But there was DNA evidence that was found on two different pieces of material.
Yes. And then
with John Benet.
Yes, and that was sort of ignored in the beginning, sadly. And then as DNA technology evolved, they were able to apply that and recover more samples in other areas of the crime scene and their clothing, all consistent with one another. And that gave the district attorney, I forget the exact word she used, but the ability to say without doubt that this is what happened. She also apologized, which is a wonderful thing for her to do.
Yes, she did.
You know, psychologists say the greatest loss a human being could ever go through is the loss of a small child. Mm-hmm. It is the #1 most difficult thing. But God will help you, and if you've gone through that loss, I'm so sorry. I have not experienced that, so I don't know what that would be like, except I know it would just have to be so terrible. But if God can help John Ramsey, he can help you. Again, get the book, The Other Side of Suffering. It's in bookstores now.